The tall office building stayed awake while the city slept, and only a few lights were on across the upper floors, and the streets below looked empty and quiet, and Mira, the CEO, sat alone in her glass office watching numbers on her screen that no longer excited her because something inside her felt unsettled, and she could not explain why the company was growing, yet her mind felt heavy and distant from the people who worked under her leadership. She leaned back in her chair and looked through the glass wall at the dark city, and remembered how this company started small with hard work and shared effort, and now it felt like a machine that ran without heart, and she wondered when she stopped knowing the lives of the people who cleaned the floors and fixed the lights and stayed late when others went home. Her eyes moved to the security screen mounted on the wall more out of habit than interest, and that was when she noticed the same figure she had seen many nights before, a quiet janitor named Arun, who worked without complaint, and rarely spoke more than necessary, and always kept his head down during the day. It was nearly 2 in the morning, and Arun was still working as usual, pushing his cart slowly across the lobby with steady hands and calm movements, and Mira noticed how carefully he worked, as if the empty building mattered just as much as when it was full of people. She watched him finish his routine, and park the cart neatly in its place, and instead of heading to the staff room, or the exit, he paused for a moment, as if checking time in his head, and then walked straight out of the building with a quiet confidence that surprised her. Mira frowned slightly because this was not the first time she had seen this pattern, and curiosity stirred inside her again because Arun always left at the same hour, and never rushed, and never looked tired like the others who worked late nights. She told herself that it was none of her concern, yet her hand reached for her coat, almost on its own, and she stood up feeling a strange mix of hesitation and excitement, because she knew she was about to cross a line that most leaders never crossed. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual, and her reflection in the mirrored walls looked unsure and thoughtful, and she wondered what she would even do if Arun noticed her following him, and what explanation she would give if anyone asked. Outside the building the night air felt cool and sharp, and the city sounded different with fewer cars and distant echoes instead of constant noise, and Mira spotted Arun walking ahead under a broken streetlight with long steady steps. She followed from a distance, keeping to the shadows, feeling foolish yet unable to stop, and she realized how little she knew about the lives of people who worked under her roof, and how easily they became invisible once their job was done. Arun turned into a narrow street lined with closed shops and faded signs, and Mira slowed her pace, watching him carefully, and noticing how his posture straightened, as if he was more alert now than he ever looked during work hours. He walked with purpose, as if he knew exactly where he was going, and the calm, tired janitor image no longer fit the man moving ahead of her, and Mira felt a quiet tension build in her chest as questions crowded her mind. The street opened into a rough area with old buildings and cracked walls, and Arun stopped near a large warehouse that looked abandoned with broken windows and peeling paint, and Mira hid behind a parked car trying to stay unseen. She watched him unlock a side door with ease and step inside, and moments later a light flickered on, casting moving shadows across the dirty walls, and faint sounds reached her ears, sounds that were sharp and rhythmic, not random or careless. Mira held her breath and moved closer, staying near the wall and peering through a cracked window, and what she saw made her forget the cold night and her own doubts. Inside the warehouse Arun moved with speed and precision, setting up equipment, checking items on a table, and adjusting straps with practiced ease, and there was nothing casual about his actions and nothing uncertain in his movements. The space was clean in an unexpected way, with tools arranged carefully, and notes pinned neatly on the wall, and maps spread across a large board marked with lines and symbols that meant nothing to her. Mira felt a sudden shift in how she saw him, because this was not a man passing time or chasing a hobby, and whatever he was doing required discipline and focus and deep commitment. Her mind raced through possibilities, and none of them matched the quiet janitor who nodded politely in the hallways and avoided attention during office hours. She stepped back slowly, her heart beating faster, and a strange sense of respect mixed with confusion filled her thoughts, because she realized she had made assumptions about Arun without ever knowing him. At that moment her phone vibrated softly in her hand, and she flinched, looking down to see a message from security, asking if she was still inside the building, and she typed a quick reply without thinking, her eyes still fixed on the warehouse door. Mira knew she should leave and forget what she had seen and return to her safe world of meetings and reports, but something stronger than logic held her there, because she felt that this discovery mattered. As she stood in the shadows of the quiet street, she understood that the company she led was built on people like Arun, people with hidden stories and unseen strength, and she wondered how many truths she had ignored for years. The warehouse light stayed on, and the sounds continued steady and controlled, and Mira knew that this night had already changed something inside her, and that following Arun was only the beginning of a truth she was not yet ready to face. Mira stepped away from the warehouse and walked back toward her car with slow, careful steps, and every sound around her felt louder than before, and her thoughts refused to settle as images of Arun moving with control replayed again and again in her mind. She drove home through empty streets and red lights blinked without purpose, and she realized she had never felt this awake at such an hour, and sleep stayed far from her even when she finally lay down in her quiet apartment. When morning came, she arrived at the office earlier than usual, and the building felt different to her now, as if every hallway held unseen stories, and every worker carried a life that did not end when the workday did. Mira passed Arun in the corridor, and he greeted her with the same polite nod and calm eyes, and nothing in his face hinted at the man she had seen hours earlier, and that contrast unsettled her more than the discovery itself. She spent the day distracted, and meetings felt long and voices blended together, and her mind kept returning to the warehouse, and the organized tools and the maps on the wall, and the quiet intensity of Arun's movements. By afternoon she made a decision that felt both risky and necessary, and she asked the security team for access logs related to the warehouse area, under the excuse of checking in used properties owned by the company. The files showed nothing unusual on the surface, and the warehouse was listed as storage long forgotten and rarely visited, and yet the power usage records told another story with steady activity late at night. Mira leaned back in her chair and stared at the screen, realizing that Arun was not hiding from the company but working within its blind spots, and that thought made her question how many blind spots she had allowed to exist. That evening she stayed late again, not out of habit, but intention, and when the clock neared 2 she watched the security screen with focused attention as Arun completed his routine just as before. Once again he left the building calmly, and Mira followed, though this time she felt more prepared and less afraid, and the night seemed to welcome her presence rather than warn her away. At the warehouse she did not hide this time, and when Arun opened the side door she stepped forward and called his name with a steady voice that surprised even herself. Arun froze for a brief moment, and then turned slowly, and his eyes met hers without fear, and without anger, and only quiet understanding passed between them. Mira told him she had followed him, and she expected shock or denial, but instead he nodded as if he had known this moment would come eventually. He invited her inside with a simple gesture, and the warehouse felt warmer than the night air and brighter than before, and Mira took in every detail with new eyes. Arun explained that this place was where he trained young people from nearby streets, giving them discipline, structure, and skills to stay away from harmful paths, and he spoke without pride and without secrecy. He showed her schedules and notes and equipment, and everything had purpose and care, and Mira felt a tightness in her chest as she realized how much effort and time he gave without asking for recognition. He told her he worked as a janitor by choice because it gave him stability and freedom to continue this work quietly, and without drawing attention that could disrupt the fragile trust he had built with the youth. Mira listened in silence, and the warehouse no longer felt mysterious but meaningful, and she understood now that the shock she felt was not about surprise but about her own limited view of worth. Arun spoke of responsibility and patience and how change happened slowly, one person at a time, and his words carried weight earned through action, not titles. Mira felt humbled standing there, realizing that leadership was not confined to offices and boardrooms, and that true influence often lived in places unseen. When she finally left the warehouse, the night felt calmer, and her heart felt heavy yet clear, and she knew that this truth would not allow her to return to her old way of seeing the world. The next morning she arrived at work with a quiet resolve and began planning changes not in policy alone, but in how she would listen and observe and value the people who kept her company alive. She knew that Arun had trusted her with something precious, and that trust carried responsibility, and she intended to honor it not with words but with action. Mira carried the weight of what she had learned into every corner of her day, and the office no longer felt like a place of authority alone but a place of responsibility that reached far beyond contracts and profit lines. She began arriving earlier and staying later, not to watch but to listen and observe, and she noticed small things she once ignored, like tired eyes, careful hands, and quiet pride in simple work done well. Her meetings slowly changed tone, and instead of speaking first she asked questions and allowed silence to exist until others felt safe enough to speak, and this shift unsettled some leaders but encouraged many others. Arun continued his work as before and never mentioned the warehouse again, and Mira respected that silence, knowing that true work did not need constant discussion or approval. Weeks passed, and Mira started a quiet program inside the company focused on skill sharing and growth without attaching her name to it, and she ensured that opportunities reached people who were often overlooked. She arranged flexible hours for night staff, improved safety, and added learning sessions that felt supportive rather than forced, and the atmosphere of the building slowly softened. One evening she received a report about rising tension in nearby neighborhoods and remembered the warehouse and the young people Arun supported, and she felt a pull to do more without exposing him. She reached out through trusted channels and directed resources quietly toward community spaces and training programs, allowing them to grow without heavy oversight or control. Arun noticed the changes not through words but through outcomes, and one night he thanked Mira with a simple nod that carried deep meaning, and she understood that respect had been earned, not granted. The company culture began to shift, and productivity rose not from pressure but from trust, and people stayed late not out of fear but purpose and pride. Mira faced resistance from some board members who questioned her focus and methods, and she listened calmly, explaining that strength came from stability and care, not shortcuts. Her calm confidence unsettled critics, and over time results spoke louder than arguments, and the numbers followed the values rather than the other way around. Late one night Mira visited the warehouse again, this time invited openly, and she watched young people train, learn, and support one another with focus and respect. She saw Arun guide without control, correct without judgment, and lead without raising his voice, and she realized that leadership could be quiet and still powerful. Standing there she felt a deep sense of clarity, and understood that the shock of that first night had transformed into purpose. She knew now that her role was not to stand above others but to create space where hidden strength could grow safely. As she left the warehouse that night she looked back once more and felt grateful that curiosity had led her beyond comfort and into understanding. The city slept around her, unaware that change was already moving through its streets, carried by people who worked in silence and believed in steady effort. Time moved forward quietly, and the changes Mira started continued to grow in ways she could not fully control, yet she trusted the process because it was built on care rather than command. The office felt different now, with warmer conversations and shared respect, and people greeted one another with ease instead of distance, and this shift showed in their work and their pride. Mira no longer watched the security screens late at night, because she did not need to follow anyone to understand them, and trust had replaced curiosity. Arun remained steady in his role, never seeking praise and never changing his routine, and yet his influence spread quietly through the company and beyond. The warehouse became a safe place for many young people, and their confidence grew as they learned discipline, patience, and self-belief, and they carried those lessons back into their lives. Mira ensured support flowed without exposure, and she protected the space by keeping it free from attention that could turn care into control. One evening the board invited Mira to speak about the transformation within the company, and she stood before them calm and clear, sharing stories without names and results without exaggeration. She spoke about listening, about unseen effort, and about the power of trust, and the room grew quiet as people understood that success had many faces. After the meeting, a senior member approached her and admitted that they had underestimated the strength of her approach, and Mira accepted the words with grace, knowing change took time. Later that night she walked through the building and stopped by the lobby where Arun worked, and she thanked him not for what he did at night, but for who he was every day. Arun smiled gently and said that everyone carried more than one life, and that respect allowed those lives to exist without conflict. Mira left the building feeling complete, and she realized that leadership had changed her as much as it had changed others. The city outside felt alive with quiet purpose, and she knew that many people moved through the night doing work unseen yet essential. Months later the company hosted a simple gathering inviting families and communities, and the energy felt honest and grounded rather than polished. Mira watched from a distance as people connected and shared stories, and she noticed young faces she recognized from the warehouse standing taller and speaking with confidence. Arun stood among them not as a leader above, but as a guide beside, and Mira felt a deep sense of gratitude for the path curiosity had opened. As the evening ended she understood that the shock of what happened at 2 in the morning had turned into understanding, and then into lasting change. She returned home that night knowing that true success was not found in control or image, but in creating space for people to become their best selves. The story of the company continued forward, shaped by quiet effort and shared respect, and the city slept peacefully, unaware of the steady work happening within its walls.